The dust still hung in the air of the military range, a haze of burnt powder and sharp echoes that hadn't yet settled after the last barrage of gunfire. The general's mocking laughter had long since faded, replaced by the stunned silence of his men who had just witnessed something none of them would forget. The woman he had ridiculed, the one he had dismissed as a civilian without discipline, had stepped up with a borrowed rifle, steadied herself with unshakable calm, and in a few clean bursts outshot every soldier on his team. Her shots hadn't just landed on target, they had carved through the bullseyes with surgical precision, stacking holes so close together they looked like single punches through paper. For a moment after her display, the range was so quiet that the click of her safety switch sounded like a thunderclap. She lowered the rifle with a small, almost amused smile tugging at the corners of her lips, and in that silence, the soldiers shuffled awkwardly, glancing between their general and the woman who had just humiliated them all without breaking a sweat. The general's face was hard, his jaw set as if trying to grind his frustration into dust, but his eyes betrayed the flicker of something more complicated than anger. It was the look of a man who had underestimated an opponent and now couldn't quite decide whether to be furious or impressed. She said nothing at first, simply resting the rifle against the bench, as though what she had done wasn't worth bragging about. That nonchalance made the moment even sharper, as if her silence itself was a louder victory than any words could be. The general finally cleared his throat, masking his humiliation with a stiff smirk, and muttered something about luck under his breath, but the men standing behind him weren't buying it. They had seen her control, her consistency, the way her eyes never wavered from the scope. Luck had nothing to do with it, and the fact that she hadn't even broken her calm posture while they were sweating through their drills only deepened their respect for her. One of the younger soldiers let out a low whistle, quickly silenced by the general's glare, but the sound lingered in the air like an unspoken admission. She turned her head slightly, catching the general's eyes, and held his gaze without flinching. There was no arrogance in her look, only a quiet assurance, as if to say that she had nothing to prove to him but had proven it anyway. That unshaken confidence stung far more than open defiance would have. As the day moved forward, the general tried to shake off the sting of the encounter, barking new orders and rallying his men back into formation. He ordered them into combat drills, close-quarters maneuvers, anything to divert their attention from what had just transpired. Yet even as they obeyed, there was an unspoken shift in the air. They followed his commands, but their eyes flicked toward her every so often, curiosity and admiration blending in equal measure. It was as though she had disrupted an invisible hierarchy, carving out her place among hardened soldiers without needing rank or uniform. The general could sense it too, and that unsettled him more than her shooting had. Respect among soldiers was not given lightly, and when it shifted, it had power. He found himself replaying her shots in his mind against his will, remembering the way she had leaned into the recoil, controlled her breathing, calculated her bursts. It was the kind of instinct that usually took years of drilling to hone, yet she had carried it with casual ease. If she was a civilian, then she was unlike any civilian he had ever met. Later, when the drills ended and the sun sank lower, painting the range in shades of amber and rust, the general approached her with an expression carefully schooled into neutrality. His men kept their distance, watching out of the corners of their eyes as if the conversation was another battle in itself. He stopped just short of her, arms crossed, his voice low and edged. "You think you impressed someone out there?" he asked, his tone flat but carrying an undercurrent of challenge. She raised her brows slightly, meeting his question with one of her own. "Didn't I?" she replied, her voice calm, not sharp but carrying weight. It wasn't boastful, but it wasn't apologetic either. It was a statement of fact, and it pressed against the fragile boundary of his pride. For a long moment they stood locked in silence, the only sound the faint shuffle of boots from his men pretending not to eavesdrop. Then the general gave a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You're dangerous," he said finally, his tone equal parts grudging respect and warning. "Dangerous because you don't know where you belong." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time she let a hint of fire into her voice. "Maybe it's because I don't belong anywhere that I can beat those who think they do." The words hung in the air like sparks, small but potent, and even the general had no immediate retort. He studied her, really studied her, as though trying to peel back the layers that shielded her from his authority. There was something in her bearing, something disciplined yet untethered, that hinted at a past she hadn't revealed. Soldiers didn't shoot like that without years of training, and yet she carried no insignia, no marks of service. It was a mystery, and men like him hated mysteries. Yet beneath his irritation, a grudging thought crept in. If she could outshoot his best, maybe she could be more than just a disruption. Maybe she was an asset he hadn't yet claimed. But pride was a powerful thing, and for now he buried that thought under the harder layer of control. The night came on fast, the campfires crackling as the soldiers settled into their routines. Stories were shared, meals passed around, but the undercurrent of tension remained. She sat alone at the edge of the firelight, her eyes distant, her hands absently cleaning the rifle she had borrowed earlier. The men glanced toward her often, not out of suspicion, but out of a reluctant respect that bordered on curiosity. She didn't ask to join their circle, and they didn't invite her, but the unspoken bond was already there. The general watched from a distance, his face unreadable, though his mind was not at rest. He knew this was only the beginning, that tomorrow would bring new challenges, and that somehow this woman, this outsider, had already become a shadow in the heart of his command. He wasn't sure yet if she was a threat to his authority or the ally he hadn't known he needed, but one thing was clear, she would not be ignored. The dawn broke cold and sharp, the kind of morning that smelled of dust, iron, and the faint promise of conflict. The camp stirred awake with the clatter of boots and the hiss of canteens filling at the water drums, soldiers shaking off sleep and slipping back into the armor of routine. She was already awake before them, crouched at the range's edge with the rifle dismantled across a blanket. Her hands moved with an ease that spoke of muscle memory, sliding the bolt free, checking the chamber, running a cloth through the barrel until it gleamed. There was something meditative in the way she did it, not rushed but precise, every motion deliberate. When the general walked past with his officers, he couldn't help but notice the way her focus narrowed to the mechanics of the weapon, as though the world around her had been tuned out. She didn't look up at him, didn't acknowledge the authority that usually demanded attention, and for some reason that irritated him more than outright defiance. He kept walking, but his thoughts lingered behind, circling her presence like a shadow. Training drills began again, harsher than the day before. The general barked orders with extra bite in his tone, pushing his men harder, demanding cleaner formations, tighter maneuvers. It was as though he was trying to scrub away the memory of yesterday's humiliation with discipline, as though forcing them into perfection would erase the image of her cutting through targets like a blade through silk. But soldiers are human, and humans remember. They remembered the way her shots had landed, the composure she had carried, and now every time their rounds scattered wide, they thought of her. He noticed it in their eyes, that flicker of self-doubt, and it gnawed at him. During one of the breaks, two of his men even drifted toward her, asking quiet questions about breathing techniques and sight alignment. She answered with calm brevity, showing them how to exhale slowly, how to squeeze rather than jerk the trigger. They listened, nodding, absorbing her words like students before a teacher. The general spotted them and barked their names, snapping them back into line, but the seed had been planted. Respect was a wildfire, and it had already started to spread. By midday the sun was high, and the air shimmered with heat. Sweat rolled down brows and fatigue dulled the edges of discipline. The general called for a challenge to shake the lethargy out of his men, a live-fire exercise designed to test speed and precision under pressure. Targets would pop up unpredictably across the range, some at distance, others close, some moving, some partially obscured. He lined his best squad for the drill, men who had earned reputations for steadiness in chaos. As they prepared, his eyes flicked toward her, seated calmly under the shade of a canvas awning, sipping from a battered canteen. Something inside him itched, a need to put her back in her place. "You," he called suddenly, his voice sharp enough to cut through the chatter. Every head turned as he pointed at her. "You think yesterday was something? Step up. Show me you can handle it under pressure, not just at paper targets." She rose slowly, setting the canteen aside, her expression unreadable. There was no hesitation in her stride as she walked toward the firing line, her boots crunching in the dirt. She picked up the same rifle she had used before, checked the magazine, and stood beside the squad without needing to be told where to go. The men beside her looked uneasy, not because they doubted her, but because they knew what it meant. If she outperformed them again, it would wound their general's pride even deeper. Still no one spoke. The signal horn blared and the drill began. Targets sprang up from the dirt, steel silhouettes painted in drab green, popping left and right with mechanical whirs. Gunfire cracked instantly, the squad unleashing controlled bursts, but over their thunder came the steady rhythm of her shots. She didn't spray bullets, she placed them. Every pull of her trigger was measured, deliberate, and when her rounds hit, the clang of steel was unmistakable. Left, right, mid-range, long, she pivoted with uncanny awareness, never rushing, never flinching, her body moving as if the chaos was a dance she had memorized long ago. When the final target dropped, the range echoed with silence again, smoke rising in thin, wavering streams. The soldiers panted, wiping sweat from their brows, checking their magazines. She simply lowered her rifle and clicked the safety. The score was tallied, and the numbers told the story the general didn't want to hear. She hadn't just kept pace, she had exceeded them, hitting every single target with near-perfect timing, missing none. His squad had respectable scores, but hers was flawless. The murmurs began immediately, soldiers exchanging glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others grinning despite themselves. The general's jaw tightened and his hands clenched behind his back. It wasn't just skill anymore, it was consistency, proof that yesterday hadn't been a fluke. He wanted to call it luck again, but the evidence was too sharp, too clean. She had outshot his best men under pressure with no warning, and done it without breaking a sweat. He dismissed the drill with a clipped order, his tone colder than the steel targets now riddled with holes. The men dispersed, but their eyes lingered on her as they went. She walked back to the shade, sat down, and began disassembling the rifle again, her movements as calm as if she had just finished a morning chore. That calmness was what unsettled him most. Men who performed at that level usually carried an edge, a hunger, the visible drive of ambition. She carried none of that, at least not openly. It was as though this was simply who she was, not a performance, not a competition. He hated that it made her more difficult to read. He prided himself on sizing people up quickly, breaking them down to their essence, but with her, the puzzle only deepened. The more he tried to fit her into a category, the less she seemed to belong to any of them. That evening, when the men gathered for rations, he stayed back, choosing to observe instead of joining their banter. She sat alone again, though a few of the younger soldiers drifted close, their body language betraying the magnetic pull she now carried. They asked her where she had trained, how she had learned to shoot like that, if she had ever served. She gave vague answers, never offering details, only enough to satisfy the surface of their curiosity. Still, they hung on her words, nodding, grinning, laughing softly when she let a rare smirk slip. He watched it unfold with an expression carefully blank, but inside, something nodded. Authority wasn't just about commands, it was about loyalty, belief, the invisible thread that tied men together. And whether she meant to or not, she was tugging on that thread, weaving herself into it. That was dangerous. More dangerous, perhaps, than her shooting. He knew then that he would have to test her again, not with drills or targets, but with something that revealed more than skill. Something that revealed loyalty, purpose, the why behind the talent. Until then he would watch her closely, because one truth had already become unavoidable: she was no longer just an outsider. She was becoming part of the story of his unit, whether he allowed it or not. The night pressed heavy against the camp, the sky thick with stars that glittered like fragments of shattered glass. The fires burned low, throwing long shadows across the ground, and the air hummed with the low murmur of men exchanging stories to chase away fatigue. Yet beneath the surface chatter, an unspoken current ran through the camp, one that carried her name like a secret passed from mouth to mouth. She was still seated at the edge of the firelight, polishing the rifle she had grown so familiar with, her hands steady, her face unreadable. The soldiers stole glances at her, some with curiosity, others with admiration, a few with lingering disbelief, but no one could deny what they had seen. She had bested them twice, in front of their general, under his rules, and she had done it without seeking recognition or reward. That kind of control earned respect in the harshest environments, and though they didn't say it aloud, the soldiers were beginning to consider her as one of their own. The general, however, sat alone at his table, his expression dark, his eyes occasionally flicking her way. He wasn't just thinking about her skills anymore. He was thinking about the shift she was creating, the fracture in authority that could widen if left unchecked. Sleep came late to the camp, but the general stayed awake longer than most, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He remembered the mocking words he had thrown at her the first day, the smirk on his lips when he assumed she would crumble under the weight of the rifle, and how quickly that moment had turned against him. He was not a man who often regretted his words, but now he wondered if his taunt had done more than embarrass him. It had set something in motion. She wasn't here by chance, he thought. People like her didn't just wander into military camps and dismantle the pride of seasoned soldiers. There was a reason behind her composure, a history buried under that calm exterior, and if he wanted to understand what kind of storm he was dealing with, he would need to uncover it. He decided then, quietly, that tomorrow he would stop testing her in drills. He would put her in a situation where instinct and truth revealed themselves. That was the only way to know who she really was. The next morning broke gray and brittle, the air tinged with the scent of rain though no clouds had yet opened. The general gathered his men early, ordering them to pack light and prepare for a march. There were whispers about a reconnaissance run into the scrublands beyond the ridge, where rumors spoke of hostile scouts probing the edges of their territory. It was meant to be a simple sweep, but the way the general called it, the way his tone cut sharp through the air, suggested something else. She was already awake, her belongings packed neatly as if she had anticipated the call. When he announced that she would be accompanying the squad, the murmurs grew louder, surprise mixing with unease. Some of the men glanced at her with silent encouragement, others with worry. She didn't react at all, only lifted the strap of her pack over her shoulder and fell into formation as if she had belonged there from the start. The general caught the flicker of admiration in his men's faces, and it only deepened the knot in his chest. He kept his expression unreadable, but inside, the decision had already hardened. This march would be her true test. They moved out at first light, boots crunching against dry earth, rifles slung, eyes scanning the horizon. The landscape was unforgiving, a stretch of jagged rocks and low scrub that seemed to whisper with every gust of wind. Hours passed in disciplined silence, broken only by the occasional hand signal or the faint clatter of gear. She moved with them effortlessly, her steps quiet, her eyes sharp as though she had marched these kinds of roads 100 times before. The men noticed, and though none dared speak, their respect for her deepened with every mile. At one point, a scout reported movement on the ridge ahead, possible hostiles. The squad tightened, slipping into cover, rifles raised. The general's eyes slid toward her, watching not just her aim but her reaction. She crouched low, steady, scanning with a predator's calm, not a flicker of fear in her posture. When the figures appeared over the ridge, 3 armed raiders, lean and sharp-eyed, she didn't wait for orders. With swift precision, she brought her rifle up and fired a single shot, dropping the lead raider before he could even level his weapon. The squad erupted into controlled fire, cutting down the remaining 2 in seconds. When the dust cleared, the men were breathing hard, their nerves electric, but she remained composed, lowering her rifle as though the moment had been no different than striking targets on the range. The general called for a halt, his face unreadable as he surveyed the scene. The men gathered around, muttering low about her speed, her accuracy, the uncanny way she had reacted without hesitation. For soldiers hardened by countless drills, that kind of instinct was rare. He studied her carefully, noting not just her skill but the absence of any adrenaline crash. No trembling hands, no quickened breath. She had done it before. That much was certain. She had seen combat, real combat, and it showed in the way she carried herself. He wanted to press her, to demand answers, but the battlefield was no place for interrogation. Instead, he called for the squad to continue the sweep, though his mind gnawed at the puzzle she presented. Who was she before she walked into his camp? Where had she learned to move like a soldier and shoot like a machine sharpened by war? The answers hung just out of reach, and it infuriated him. As the march continued, the skies finally broke, rain falling in heavy sheets that plastered hair to faces and soaked uniforms. The ground turned to slick mud, and every step became a battle against slipping. Yet even in the storm, she moved with the same steady rhythm, her rifle cradled against her chest, her eyes scanning through the haze of rain. The men grumbled, cursed under their breath, but she said nothing. One of the younger soldiers slipped badly on a slope, tumbling hard, and before anyone else could react, she was there, pulling him up with a grip like iron, steadying him until he found his footing again. The young man gave her a grateful nod, and though the moment was small, the others noticed. Acts like that bound men together more than any speech from a commander. The general noticed too, though he said nothing, only tightening his jaw as he walked on. Every time she proved herself, every time she won another piece of his men's loyalty, the balance of power shifted, and he felt it slipping from his grasp. By the time they returned to camp at dusk, the squad was exhausted, drenched and worn to the bone. Yet there was an energy among them, a buzz carried by what they had seen that day. She had not only matched them stride for stride, she had led by example without ever calling herself a leader. They respected her not because she demanded it but because she earned it, and that kind of respect was the strongest kind of all. As the men settled back into camp, cleaning weapons and shaking off rain, they gathered closer to her than before, drawn in by the quiet gravity she carried. She spoke little, answered when asked, but every word she gave was absorbed like instruction from someone who had walked a harder road. The general watched it all from the shadows, his mind restless. He couldn't deny it anymore. She was dangerous not because of her skill, but because she was winning the hearts of his men. And in any army, that was the most potent weapon of all. The storm passed in the night, leaving the camp soaked and quiet, the earth heavy with the smell of wet soil and smoke from dying fires. Dawn crept slow and silver across the horizon, painting the soaked tents and rifles left leaning against crates in muted light. The men stirred reluctantly, shoulders sore from the march, boots still caked in mud. Yet even in their fatigue there was an energy in the air, one tied not to their general's orders but to the presence of the woman who had walked with them, fought beside them, and proven herself without hesitation. She was awake already, kneeling near the edge of the camp, hands busy cleaning the rifle that seemed to have become an extension of her body. Her face was calm, as though storms and raids were merely ordinary pieces of her life. A couple of soldiers drifted near, trading small talk with her while she worked, their respect unhidden now. They laughed quietly at a remark she made, and though it wasn't loud, the sound carried enough to catch the general's ear as he emerged from his tent. He paused, watching the scene unfold, and his stomach twisted. They were his men, but the loyalty in their eyes was shifting, bending toward someone who had never sworn an oath to him. He carried himself with practiced authority, but inside he was calculating. For years he had commanded through discipline and fear, through the certainty that no one beneath him could challenge his word. Yet now, with every smile the soldiers shared with her, with every glance they gave that was filled with trust instead of mere obedience, he felt something slipping. It was more dangerous than any bullet, it was influence. Influence was what bound armies together, and she was gathering it without even trying. He knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. If she remained, she would either become an ally he couldn't control or a rival who fractured his command. Either way, the balance had shifted, and he would not allow himself to be undermined in his own camp. Still, pride warred with pragmatism. He couldn't simply cast her out, not after what she had shown them in the field. To do so would reveal his insecurity and drive his men further toward her. No, if he wanted to regain control, he would have to be subtle. He would have to find a way to test her not just as a fighter but as a person. Everyone had a fault line. He just needed to discover hers. That morning, he called the squad together for an assignment that he framed as routine but carried weight beneath the surface. Scouts had reported a small enemy outpost hidden in the canyons to the west, a cluster of raiders who had been harassing supply lines. Normally, such a task would be handled by a larger force, but he wanted precision, silence, and speed. He ordered his best men to accompany him, and he ordered her to join them. There was no room for argument, and she didn't give one. She simply slung her rifle, adjusted her pack, and fell into step with the squad as though she had always belonged. The march was long, winding through jagged rock and narrow gullies where shadows stretched like claws. The soldiers kept their nerves tight, but she moved with the same calm rhythm, her eyes scanning, her breathing steady. The general watched her out of the corner of his eye, frustrated and fascinated at once. Every test so far she had passed. But this mission, he thought, would reveal more than her skill. Combat under fire wasn't about targets or drills, it was about choices. Choices showed the truth of a person more than aim ever could. They reached the canyon by midday, the sun a burning weight overhead. The outpost was little more than a scattering of shacks and fortified perches, but the raiders were armed and watchful, their figures shifting in the shadows of the rocks. The general ordered silence and signaled for positions. The squad moved like shadows themselves, circling the outpost, setting up angles. She crawled low across the gravel, positioning herself with a line of sight on the highest perch where a sentry sat smoking, his rifle across his knees. Through her scope, she measured the distance, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. The general, observing through his own binoculars, saw her settle into position and knew she was ready without hesitation. But instead of signaling the attack, he waited. He wanted to see what she would do without command, whether she would act on instinct or discipline. Seconds stretched into long minutes, the canyon holding its breath. Finally, when the sentry moved to raise his radio, she fired. One clean shot, the man slumping forward silently. The rest of the squad surged into action, rifles barking in coordinated bursts, sweeping through the outpost with brutal efficiency. The fight was quick but sharp, raiders scrambling, shouting, firing wild shots that ricocheted off the stone walls. She moved with the squad seamlessly, covering angles, laying down fire where gaps opened. At one point, when a raider charged with a blade, she spun, sidestepped, and drove her rifle butt into his jaw before dropping him with a round to the chest. Her movements were precise, ruthless, without hesitation. By the time the dust settled, the outpost was broken, the few surviving raiders fleeing into the wasteland. The squad gathered, breathing hard but triumphant, their adrenaline still burning. They had lost no men, sustained only minor injuries, and the efficiency of the mission only amplified the glow of victory. But more than that, it amplified her place among them. She hadn't just fought beside them, she had fought like one of them, as though she had been forged in the same fire. The men exchanged looks that carried no doubt anymore. In their eyes she belonged. The general felt the weight of that realization pressing against his pride. He had hoped the mission might reveal a weakness, a crack in her composure, but instead, it had only reinforced her strength. And worse, his men had seen it. They had seen her act without hesitation, seen her instincts save lives, seen her calm hold steady under fire. Their respect for her was no longer growing, it was cementing. He stood at the center of the canyon, scanning the broken outpost, but his gaze kept drifting back to her, kneeling to reload calmly, checking her weapon before slinging it across her back. She didn't bask in the victory, didn't boast or seek attention. That silence only made her presence louder, a quiet gravity pulling his men closer. He clenched his jaw and turned away, hiding the storm of thoughts inside him. The squad returned to camp at dusk, their boots coated in dust, their faces lined with fatigue but brightened by victory. The camp buzzed with whispers as word of the raid spread, and soon the soldiers who hadn't been there looked at her with the same mix of curiosity and respect as those who had. She became the quiet center of conversations, her name spoken with admiration even by those who tried to hide it. That night, as she sat by the fire cleaning her rifle, the circle around her grew larger, the men leaning in, laughing at small remarks, trading their own stories in hopes of drawing hers. She gave little, but she gave enough to bind them closer. The general sat alone again, watching from the shadows, and he knew the truth he hadn't wanted to face. He was losing them. The silence in the command tent was suffocating, broken only by the low hum of equipment and the occasional crackle of the comms as updates from forward scouts came in. She stood beside the operations table, her arms crossed, eyes scanning the digital display of the terrain ahead, every flicker of light from the holographic projection reflected in her steady gaze. Around her, seasoned officers, men who had spent decades in service, kept glancing at her, still unable to reconcile the fact that she had outperformed not only their subordinates but also the general himself. She felt their doubt pressing against her like a weight, yet it only fueled the fire within her. She wasn't there to win their approval, she was there to finish the mission. The general leaned forward, his jaw tight, as he examined the movement of hostile units on the map. The window will close in 6 hours. If we don't seize the site before then, reinforcements will arrive and we'll lose the chance to disable their network. His tone was sharp, commanding, but he couldn't keep his eyes from drifting toward her, the woman who had single-handedly redefined his understanding of skill and composure. He hated to admit it, but part of him now relied on her being in the field. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the tension like a blade. Your strategy hinges on pushing through the front line, but they've reinforced those positions with hidden emplacements. You'll lose half your men before you even get near the site. The tent went quiet. She tapped a control, and the map zoomed into a narrow canyon flanking the enemy stronghold. There's another way in, stealth entry through the canyon. Small unit, no heavy support, just precision. I can lead it. The officers exchanged skeptical glances, some shaking their heads. One of them scoffed under his breath, muttering something about her arrogance, but she ignored it. Her eyes stayed locked on the general, challenging him to trust her judgment. For a long moment he didn't answer, his expression unreadable. Finally, he exhaled slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that could alter the course of the mission. If you fail, we're done. If you succeed, we break them. You'll get your team, but you'd better prove you're as good as you think. She didn't flinch. I don't think, she said coldly, I know. Within the hour she was kicked up and standing at the edge of the canyon with a hand-picked unit behind her. These weren't the general's regulars. Most had volunteered to follow her after witnessing what she could do at the range and during the earlier firefight. There was trust in their eyes, raw and unspoken, and she felt the weight of it pressing on her shoulders. She wasn't just proving herself anymore, she was carrying their belief in her. The canyon stretched out before them like a scar carved deep into the earth, shadows swallowing the path ahead, jagged cliffs rising on both sides. She signaled the team forward, every footstep measured, every sound amplified in the still night. Hours passed as they crept deeper, their nerves stretched tight, until the faint glow of enemy sentries appeared ahead. Dropping to her stomach, she raised her rifle, its scope glowing faintly against her cheek. One breath, two, and then a single suppressed shot cracked the silence. The first sentry dropped without a sound. The second followed before he even realized what was happening. The team moved like ghosts, erasing the line of defense without triggering a single alarm. Her precision was frighteningly efficient. The men behind her exchanged looks of awe, realizing they were witnessing something beyond mere training or talent. This was instinct honed to perfection. They pushed deeper until the canyon opened into a clearing that gave them a view of the facility, a sprawling compound bristling with communication arrays and heavy fortifications. Patrols circled the perimeter, drones buzzed overhead, and towers gleamed with mounted weapons. It was a fortress built to withstand armies, yet here she was, planning to crack it open with only a handful of soldiers. One of her men whispered, "This is suicide." She didn't look back. "No," she said firmly, her eyes scanning the defenses, calculating every angle, every blind spot. "This is precision. Follow my lead and we'll walk out alive." Her calm certainty settled their nerves like nothing else could. She broke the unit into pairs, directing them to key positions around the facility. Timing was everything. With silent hand signals, she synchronized the team as if conducting an orchestra of shadows. One by one, patrols vanished, cameras went dark, and drones were disabled mid-flight. Within minutes they had carved open a path into the heart of the compound, leaving no trace behind. She was the last to move, sliding through the outer defenses with liquid grace, her rifle never leaving her grip. Inside the compound, the tension doubled. The corridors were narrow, lights flickering faintly, voices echoing in the distance. She raised her fist, halting the team as heavy boots approached. With surgical precision she set her trap, luring the squad of guards into a bottleneck before dropping them all with a combination of quick shots and silent takedowns. Her men stared in disbelief, hardly able to process how swiftly she dismantled opponents trained for this very environment. The deeper they went, the clearer it became. This mission wasn't just about proving her skill anymore. It was about striking at the core of the enemy's network, crippling their ability to coordinate, and saving countless lives on the battlefield. Finally they reached the central hub, a massive chamber filled with servers, consoles, and a towering array pulsing with data streams. The air thrummed with energy, and the glow of machinery bathed the room in a cold, artificial light. She raised her rifle, scanning every corner before signaling the tech specialist forward. As he hurried to plant the charges, alarms suddenly blared through the facility. A chill ran through the team, the enemy knew they were here. Floodlights snapped on, boots thundered from every direction, and the sound of mechanical doors slamming shut reverberated like a death knell. Trapped inside, outnumbered, with no reinforcements in sight. Yet she didn't falter. She moved to the center of the room, her rifle raised, her stance unyielding. "Hold the line," she barked, her voice sharp as steel. "We finish this here." The enemy poured in, a tide of armored soldiers crashing against them, gunfire tearing through the chamber. Her rifle spoke with ruthless precision, each shot dropping a target, each movement fluid and deadly. She became the anchor, the force holding the line together, her team drawing courage from her fearless stand. Blood, smoke, and fire filled the room, yet she didn't slow, didn't hesitate. She was the storm in the heart of chaos, and nothing could break her resolve. The tech shouted over the roar of battle, "Charges set." 30 seconds. Her mind raced. 30 seconds to hold against an endless wave, 30 seconds to decide whether they would live or die in that chamber. She planted herself at the front, every shot buying them another breath, another heartbeat. The seconds ticked down, and when the final call came, "Detonate," she didn't hesitate. She slammed the trigger, and the world exploded in fire and light. The blast shook the ground like a thunderclap, the walls of the compound tearing apart as fire engulfed the central hub. She hit the floor hard, the shockwave rolling over her and rattling her bones, but she never let go of her rifle. The roar of destruction was deafening, sparks raining from shattered consoles, smoke curling thick and acrid in the air. For a moment, the world dissolved into chaos, shouts, gunfire, the groaning collapse of steel supports. She forced herself up, vision blurred, ears ringing, and scanned through the haze. Her team staggered to their feet one by one, coughing and disoriented but alive. The enemy, however, wasn't finished. Reinforcements surged through the wreckage, their eyes glowing behind visors, weapons raised, determined to cut them down before they could escape. She didn't think, she reacted. Her rifle snapped up, muzzle flashing as she cut down the first wave, each shot precise even through the smoke. Her body moved on instinct, weaving between cover, dragging her men into positions that gave them better angles. The firestorm around them only heightened her focus. Where others saw chaos, she saw patterns, routes, timings, openings, and she exploited every single one. The charges had gutted the enemy's communications array, flames licking up the shattered servers, sparks cascading like stars as the enemy's network collapsed. But destruction alone wasn't enough. They had to get out alive, had to bring proof back to command that the mission had succeeded. She barked orders over the din, voice carrying above the noise. Move toward the breach. Use the collapse as cover. Her men obeyed without question now. Doubt had no place here. They had seen her in the fire and knew she could carve a path even through hell itself. They pushed toward the gaping wound the explosion had opened in the compound wall, debris littering the ground, smoke spilling into the night sky. Enemy soldiers pressed in hard, but every time they tried to close the gap, her rifle answered with merciless precision. She was everywhere at once, covering angles, laying suppressive fire, dragging the wounded, never once faltering. The team broke into the open air, lungs burning with smoke, but the night outside wasn't silent either. Alarms blared across the valley, spotlights cutting through the darkness, enemy convoys roaring toward the compound from every direction. The explosion had crippled their communications hub, but it had also announced their presence like a flare in the sky. They weren't done fighting, not even close. She scanned the terrain, heart hammering, eyes narrowing on the canyon they had come through. It was their only way out, but enemy units were already converging on it. Her mind raced, calculating routes and risks in the span of seconds. Split into pairs, move in staggered intervals, keep your comms tight, she ordered, her tone sharp, leaving no room for argument. She would take the rear, she always did. She was the shield, the anchor, the one who absorbed the danger so her team could live. They sprinted through the darkness, weaving between rocks and smoking wreckage, gunfire snapping at their heels. She moved like a phantom, dropping enemies who tried to flank, her bullets striking with deadly accuracy even at full sprint. Every pull of the trigger was survival, every heartbeat earned another step toward escape. The canyon loomed closer, its jagged walls promising cover but also trapping them if the enemy closed in too tight. She felt the tension coil tighter in her chest, but she pushed it down, driving the team harder. Almost there, she growled into the calm, her voice steady even as her lungs burned. Don't stop, don't look back. The first pairs slipped into the canyon, shadows vanishing into deeper darkness. She covered their retreat, cutting down another squad that tried to block the entrance. Her rifle ran dry, and with a fluid motion she switched to her sidearm, each shot ringing like a hammer in the night. She didn't miss. She never missed. By the time she finally ducked into the canyon herself, the rest of the team had set up a defensive line, rifles aimed back toward the valley. The enemy was advancing in force, lights sweeping the terrain, vehicles growling closer, the sound of treads grinding against rock echoing through the night. They couldn't outrun armor. She crouched behind a boulder, chest heaving, mind racing. The canyon was their lifeline, but it could also become their grave if those vehicles made it through. She needed to stop them. No, she needed to outthink them. Her eyes darted to the jagged cliffs above, loose rocks and unstable formations silhouetted in the floodlights. An idea sparked, reckless and dangerous, but it was their only chance. She scaled the cliff with the agility of someone who refused to accept failure, her fingers digging into stone, boots scraping as she climbed higher. Bullets whined past her, but she didn't falter, didn't look down. At the top she crawled along the ridge, heart pounding, and found what she was looking for. A shelf of rock, fractured and unstable, hanging over the mouth of the canyon like a sword waiting to fall. She pulled the last of her explosives from her pack, her hands steady even as the roar of engines grew louder below. She set the charges carefully, every placement deliberate, her mind counting down the seconds she had left. When she was done, she slid back to the edge, her eyes narrowing as the first convoy of vehicles came into view, armored transports bristling with soldiers, headlights blazing like predatory eyes. She waited, breath held, timing it to perfection. When the lead vehicle reached the kill zone, she hit the detonator. The night exploded again. The cliff roared as tons of rock sheared loose, an avalanche of stone and dust cascading onto the convoy. Vehicles vanished under the crushing weight, enemy soldiers screamed as the canyon mouth collapsed, sealing the path with fire and rubble. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames. She stood at the cliff's edge, chest heaving, the detonator still in her hand. She had bought them time. When she climbed back down, her team looked at her with something beyond respect now. It was awe. She had saved them again, turned certain death into survival with nothing but courage and cunning. But there was no celebration, no relief, only the grim knowledge that the fight wasn't over. They still had miles to go through hostile terrain, with enemies hunting them and the general waiting to see whether she had delivered on her impossible promise. She gathered them quickly, her voice low but firm. "We move now. Stay sharp, stay silent. This isn't over until we're home." They obeyed without hesitation, their trust absolute. As they vanished deeper into the canyon, leaving the wreckage smoldering behind, she allowed herself a single thought. This was more than proving herself to the general, more than showing up the men who had doubted her. This was about survival, about leading when no one else could, about being the one who stepped into the fire and came out unbroken. And she knew, as the shadows swallowed them again, that the real test was still ahead. The canyon stretched on for miles, a twisting artery of stone that shielded them from the spotlights and drones above but also closed around them like a coffin. Every sound echoed off the jagged walls, amplifying the crunch of boots on gravel, the rasp of breath through filters, the faint metallic clink of gears shifting with each hurried step. She led them deeper, her eyes sweeping every shadow, every crevice, her instincts screaming that they weren't alone. The explosion she triggered at the canyon mouth had bought them time, yes, but time in war was fleeting. Their enemy wasn't a blunt force, it was persistent, adaptive, relentless. She knew they would regroup, find another route, and come hunting again. Her men followed close, exhaustion etched into their faces, but they no longer questioned her commands. They trusted her like they would trust the earth beneath their feet. She had carried them through fire, through storms of bullets, and still stood unbroken. That kind of strength didn't need speeches. It was written in every move she made, every decision that had kept them alive. Hours bled together in a haze of silent movement, the night colder now, the stars barely visible above the narrow strip of sky the canyon allowed. When the team finally halted, it was only because she raised her hand, crouching low by a bend where the rocks formed a natural overhang. She signaled them to rest in silence, her ears tuned to the faint hum in the distance, a sound too regular, too mechanical to be natural. Drones. They were sweeping the canyon from above, their searchlights probing the darkness like hungry eyes. Her jaw tightened. The avalanche had slowed the enemy, but it hadn't stopped them. She whispered into the calm, "Shut down all power. No lights, no signals. Stay under cover." The men complied instantly, and the canyon plunged into deeper darkness, their outlines melting into the stone as the drones passed overhead. She watched the beams crawl across the rock face, holding her breath as one lingered dangerously close to their position. Her finger brushed the trigger of her rifle, but she didn't fire. Patience was survival. Seconds stretched into eternity before the beam moved on, the hum fading into the distance. Only then did she exhale, her muscles coiled tight from restraint. The team moved again, slower now, every sense heightened. The canyon eventually opened into a wider basin, where the moonlight poured over jagged boulders and dry riverbeds. It should have felt like freedom after the suffocating walls, but instead it felt exposed, vulnerable. She motioned for the unit to spread into a loose formation, eyes on all angles. It was too quiet here, too still. Her gut told her danger was near, and she never ignored her gut. That instinct proved right when a sharp crack split the night. One of her men cried out, collapsing as a bullet tore through his shoulder. "Snipers!" she barked, diving behind cover as flashes lit up the ridges. Her team scattered, returning fire blindly at the cliffs above, but she knew wasting bullets was a death sentence. She pressed her cheek against the scope, scanning the high ground. There, just a glimmer, the faint distortion of a scope catching moonlight. One breath, one squeeze, and her rifle spoke. The enemy sniper's shot died in his throat as he tumbled backward out of sight. She shifted instantly, reading the terrain, anticipating the second sniper before he revealed himself. Her bullet found him in the shadows, the impact snapping his body against stone. Silence fell again, broken only by the ragged breathing of her men. She checked the wounded soldier quickly, tearing a strip of cloth to bind his bleeding shoulder. "You're not dying here," she growled, meeting his pained eyes. "Not on my watch." He nodded weakly and she pulled him to his feet, forcing the group forward once more. But the ambush had been more than snipers. The enemy knew exactly where they were headed. As they pushed through the basin, floodlights suddenly ignited ahead, blinding white beams cutting through the night. Dozens of enemy troops emerged from the rocks, rifles trained, their boots crunching as they closed the trap. Her men froze, outnumbered and outgunned, their faces pale with dread. For a heartbeat even the air seemed to still. Then she stepped forward, rifle raised, her stance defiant. She didn't speak, but her eyes blazed with challenge. The enemy commander shouted an order, weapons lifted higher, and the air trembled with tension on the edge of eruption. Then she moved. Faster than thought, her rifle snapped up and 3 soldiers dropped before the enemy realized she had fired. Her men responded instantly, unleashing a storm of gunfire. The canyon basin erupted in chaos, bullets sparking against stone, explosions shattering the ground. She was at the heart of it, weaving between cover, her precision devastating, her presence unshakable. The enemy surged, but every time they pressed, her fire broke them. Her commands drove her men like a single, unbreakable machine. The ground became a battlefield of fire and shadow, screams echoing against the rocks, the acrid stench of smoke burning their lungs. She knew they couldn't hold forever. For every enemy they dropped, more emerged from the ridges, pouring into the basin like a tide. They were being swallowed, and only something drastic would shift the balance. Her eyes darted to the fuel trucks hidden among the enemy vehicles, their tanks glinting under the floodlights. Risky, suicidal even, but it was the only way. She shouted over the chaos, "Cover me!" Her men hesitated, horror in their eyes, but she didn't wait for their protest. She sprinted across open ground, bullets tearing the earth around her, every step a defiance of death itself. She dropped enemies in her path with brutal efficiency, leaping over bodies, rolling behind a boulder just yards from the fuel trucks. Heart hammering, she pulled the last incendiary charge from her pack, primed it with steady hands and hurled it with all her strength. The charge struck true. Fire blossomed like a sun as the trucks detonated, the shockwave blasting her off her feet and turning the basin into a sea of fire. Enemy troops screamed as flames consumed them, vehicles erupted one after another, the ground trembling under the inferno. She forced herself up, ears ringing, lungs burning from the heat. The explosion had torn the enemy formation apart, chaos spreading through their ranks. Her men seized the moment, pressing the attack with renewed fury, driving the survivors into retreat. Smoke choked the air, glowing embers falling like rain, but through it all she stood tall, her rifle steady, her will unbroken. When the last shots faded and silence returned, the basin was a charred ruin, littered with wreckage and bodies. Her team staggered toward her, their faces smeared with soot and blood, but their eyes alive with something new. Not just respect, not just trust, faith. She had dragged them through hell itself, and they had come out breathing. The wounded soldier leaned against another, pale but still walking, his eyes locked on her like she was the only reason he still lived. She scanned the devastation one last time, then turned her gaze to the dark horizon. There would be more enemies, more battles, more tests ahead. But tonight, she had burned away every doubt, every sneer, every mocking word the general had ever thrown at her. She had outshot his men, outplanned his strategies, and outlasted his expectations. She had become something more than a soldier, more than a challenger. She was the mission's heartbeat, its blade, its fire. And as the night swallowed them once more, she knew the fight wasn't over, but neither was her resolve. The night stretched on like an endless battlefield, every step through the broken terrain a reminder of the firestorm they had just survived. The canyon had spat them out into rolling highlands where the ground was jagged, scarred by old bombardments, and the wind carried the bitter taste of ash. Her team moved in a staggered line behind her, their bodies battered, their ammunition running low, but their spirits unbroken. They had seen what she could do, seen her tear victory out of impossible odds, and that belief drove their legs forward even when exhaustion threatened to drag them down. She walked at the front, rifle at the ready, scanning every horizon, every flicker of movement in the distance. She could feel the weight of command pressing heavier now. Each of them trusted her with their lives, and that trust was a burden she would never cast aside. She had chosen this role the moment she stepped into the fire, and now there was no turning back. The comm unit crackled suddenly, a distorted voice cutting through the static. It was the general. "Status. Do you copy?" She lifted the receiver, her voice steady though her lungs burned. "Mission accomplished. The hub is destroyed. We're heading back." There was a pause on the other end, long enough to feel deliberate. Then his voice came again, harder, colder. "I've received reports of heavy losses in your sector." "Explain." Her jaw tightened, her eyes scanning her weary men as they trudged through the dark. Losses were inevitable given the scale of opposition. But we broke their network. They're blind, scattered. Without coordination, they can't mount another major offensive soon. That was the objective, and it's done. Another silence, then the general said, "Bring them home alive. All of them. Don't make me regret letting you lead." The line went dead. She stared at the comm for a moment, then clipped it back onto her vest. The general's tone hadn't been mocking this time. Not quite. It carried something else, a grudging respect, maybe even a reluctant recognition of her worth. But she didn't care for his approval. She only cared about finishing the mission and getting her team out of this wasteland. The sun began to rise, bleeding pale light over the horizon. Dawn revealed the scars of battle across the land, Burnt-out vehicles, shattered drones, the bodies of soldiers left where they fell. Her men moved more slowly now, fatigue dragging at their limbs, but she never allowed them to falter. She kept them moving with sharp words and sharper eyes, her determination a shield against despair. Every step mattered, every mile closed the gap between them and safety. Yet the enemy was relentless. As they crossed a ridge, the distant rumble of engines reached them. She crouched, signaling for silence, and peered over the edge. A convoy of armored vehicles moved along the valley below, searchlights probing the terrain. They weren't retreating, they were hunting. The sight clenched her gut with cold certainty. They weren't just trying to stop her team. They wanted her. Word had spread, she realized. Her defiance, her precision, her victories, they had turned her into a symbol, a threat too dangerous to ignore. That thought didn't scare her. It fueled her. If they feared her, it meant she had already won half the fight. She led her team down the far side of the ridge, keeping low, moving fast. The convoy's engines grew louder, the searchlights sweeping dangerously close, but she guided her men like shadows through the rocks. They slipped past the valley, unseen, until they reached a shallow ravine that cut toward friendlier territory. Here at last she allowed a brief pause. Her men collapsed against the rocks, gulping water, their faces hollow with exhaustion. She crouched with them, her back to the stone, her eyes scanning the sky. For a moment, just a moment, the weight of it all pressed down. She thought of the mocking smirk on the general's face back at the range, the dismissive laughter of his men. That memory had carried her through this nightmare, driving her harder with every step. But now, looking at the bruised, bloodied men who had followed her through fire and hell, she realized something. It wasn't about proving him wrong anymore. It was about proving them right. The men who had believed in her, who had chosen to follow her when no one else would. She clenched her fists, her resolve crystallizing like steel. She would not let them down. Their reprieve didn't last. The distant thunder of rotor blades rolled over the ravine, and a shadow swept across the rocks. Helicopters. The enemy had eyes in the sky now, their search tightening like a noose. Her heart hammered, but her face remained stone. We move. Now. She pushed them to their feet, her voice sharper than ever. They scrambled out of the ravine, sprinting across open ground as the helicopters closed in. Gunfire raked the earth, kicking up dirt and stone, but she didn't slow. She returned fire, her bullets cutting across the sky with impossible precision. One helicopter reeled, smoke pouring from its engine, before crashing in a fiery bloom. The second veered back, wary now, circling like a predator testing its prey. She kept running, kept firing, her men at her heels, until the cover of a shattered forest swallowed them. The trees, though skeletal and burnt, broke the line of sight. For now they were safe. For now. Inside the charred forest, silence returned except for the rasp of their breathing. They collapsed in the shadows, too drained to speak, but their eyes never left her. She crouched at the edge of the treeline, rifle across her knees, every sense alert. The mission was complete, but survival was its own battle. She thought again of the general, waiting back at command, expecting her to fail, expecting her to crawl back broken. The irony burned in her chest. She wasn't crawling. She wasn't broken. She had done what none of his men could, and she had carried her team through hell to prove it. When she finally stood, the first rays of true sunlight broke through the smoke-choked sky, painting the forest in a fragile gold. She turned to her men, her voice low but steady. We're almost home. Stay sharp. This isn't over until we walk through that gate. They rose again, battered but unbowed, their faith in her burning brighter than the dawn. And so they moved, deeper into the light, leaving behind the wreckage, the smoke, the echoes of battle. Each step carried the weight of survival, of defiance, of victory carved from the jaws of defeat. She knew the war wasn't over, knew that more challenges awaited, that the general's pride would not fade easily, nor the enemy's thirst for revenge. But she also knew something else, something undeniable. She had outshot them, outlasted them, outthought them all. She had turned their mockery into silence, their doubts into awe. And as her boots struck the scarred earth, her rifle steady in her hands, she knew one truth above all. This was only the beginning. The end.